Thank you. I will allow a wee bit of latitude for other frontbenchers should they take interventions, although it's entirely a matter to them whether they do, and that is why I allowed a bit of latitude with the Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Donald Cameron to speak to and to move Amendment 7429.1 up to 7 minutes, please, Mr Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I move the amendment in my name? At the beginning of a new year, there might have been an opportunity for a new approach from this government. But no, entirely predictably, they have chosen the Constitution as the subject of their first debate of 2023. We have an ongoing global cost of living crisis. We have a bitter and violent war in Europe, and we have total turmoil in our public services here in Scotland. The NHS on its knees, primary schools closed today, many secondary schools closed tomorrow, and at the top of this government's list of priorities in this chamber, another independence referendum. What on earth are they thinking? This debate is nothing short of shameful, Presiding Officer. If the passion and energy expended today was concentrated instead on health education, we would be in a much, much better place. Not least because as a matter of law, it is now unequivocally clear that this Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence. The Supreme Court's judgment in November was unambiguous. With that in mind, it begs the question as to why we are here once again debating this issue. It may be that the SNP needs to give its hardcore supporters some red meat to keep them happy. It may be that this government has completely ran out of new ideas on how to deliver for the people of Scotland. It may be that the only thing the SNP wants to talk about is the Constitution because it has failed so monumentally elsewhere. Let's take the NHS as one obvious example. Parliament heard earlier today from the Cabinet Secretary, but only after pressure from these benches and others, to address the state of the NHS. And a statement by a minister falls woefully short of a proper and rigorous debate of the issues here in this chamber. Let me dwell on those failures for a moment, because this is what we should be debating. On Sunday, comments from the Deputy Chair of the BMA said that patient safety was now at risk every day in A&E departments in Scotland, an NHS facing an unprecedented crisis. Dr Ian Kennedy, the BMA Chair, this morning on BBC Scotland, the NHS in Scotland is broken. Members telling me they're exhausted, burnt out, considering their futures, many parts of the NHS collapsing. So we have no doubt that the NHS in Scotland, in its current form, is unsustainable. Yes.
Julie Martin.
I'm delighted to talk about health. Would Donald Cameron concede that Brexit has been a real problem for the NHS in Scotland, if not the UK? And that's one of the reasons we need a democratic right to decide to go back into the EU as an independent state.
Donald Cameron.
The problems in our NHS in Scotland began long before the vote for Brexit in 2016. She knows that. The NHS in Scotland is broken. Stark words from one of our most senior doctors, despite repeated warnings that a winter crisis was looming. Doctors and nurses weren't impressed by the measures announced yesterday. This is what we should be debating. Let me give one concrete example. Last week, we know that bed occupancy rates in hospitals were over 95%. That's 10% over the 85% rate, which is seen as the maximum figure before patients are put at risk. That kind of occupancy rate is not sustainable in providing the safe and effective care that patients need on a daily basis. That's what the BMA said. And they're right. And if the SNP focus more on supporting the NHS and fixing the long-standing problems that exist there, rather than obsessing over independence, then perhaps some of these issues could have been addressed. And I make no apology for focusing on these matters, because it isn't just the NHS where SNP ministers have lost focus. In education, Deputy Presiding Officer, we know there are 900 fewer teachers than when the SNP came to power, and that the attainment gap between the least and most deprived is wider than it was 5 years ago. We know that police numbers in Scotland are at their lowest level since 2008, and that violent crime has risen to its highest level since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister. And we know that in transport, this SNP government has presided over the botched nationalisation of Ferguson Marine, the delay of 2 ferries, could run into £200 million over budget, with island communities suffering as a result. Failure after failure after failure, and all because this government has only one real priority. And a Salvation poll published on Monday stated that only 8% of people feel the Scottish Government should prioritise an independence referendum. Just 8%. So turning to what the Cabinet Secretary's motion says, if the SNP were honest about listening to and respecting the wishes of the people of Scotland, then they would appreciate that Scotland expressed its view barely 8 years ago in the referendum that the UK government agreed to in 2014. A referendum that countless members on the SNP benches called a once-in-a-lifetime referendum. Even the Cabinet Secretary called it the opportunity of a lifetime. Well, given that opportunity, the people of Scotland voted decisively to keep Scotland in our United Kingdom and rejected independence. And we and others have always respected that outcome. The SNP and the Greens have never accepted it. And that's why the way in which this debate is being framed today is utterly ludicrous and indeed hypocritical. So to conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, the SNP Green government's obsession with agitating for a referendum that nobody wants is actually harming our public services. The government has taken its eye off the ball for too long, and people across Scotland are noticing. They are seeing the crisis unfold in our NHS. They are seeing standards falling in education and the attainment gap widening. They are seeing increasingly poor performances in public transport. And they are seeing, Deputy Presiding Officer, a government which has its head in the sand when it should be addressing the real and pressing needs of the people of Scotland, and it is an abject disgrace. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Sarah Boyack to speak to and move Amendment 7429.3. Up to 6 minutes, please, Ms Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. So this is a disappointment, this debate, but it is not a surprise in terms of the priorities of this SNP Green government. And if you look at what's happened over the last few weeks, over the festive period, we had severe weather which caused significant disruption for many parts of Scotland, put massive pressures on resilience services, and in the run-up, if you will respect my right to actually respond to your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, just give me a couple of seconds. The point I'm making, which is absolutely clear in our amendment, is this is the wrong choice for our first debate this year. We should be focusing on the NHS. In the run-up to New Year, doctors in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde pleaded with the Health Board to declare a major incident, while NHS Grampian issued an appeal for all staff to come in. And when the Cabinet Secretary earlier this afternoon referred to NHS Lothian today, he did not acknowledge the long-standing deep issues in relation to underfunding, the lack of capacity which NHS Lothian has now and going forward with our increasing population, and crucially the lack of social care. And those were not issues that started through COVID, and in fact there were not even issues that started because we left the EU. They were in place long before that. And we know from repeated comments by representatives of the BMA that they are seriously worried about patient safety being put at risk every single day, and I will not be the only MSP that gets repeated references from constituents who cannot get through to the NHS, and they end up going to A&E. Now, the SNP and Green MSPs voted against our Labour proposals to debate those issues today, and they opted for their #1 priority to debate the Constitution rather than tackling the health crisis and the cost of living crisis that is getting worse. Yes, I will, briefly.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the member for giving way. The member asks why we are talking about independence.
Dr Allen, could you please ensure your card's on and your microphone is on?
It is, yeah.
Your microphone's on? It doesn't sound like it. Well, the microphone isn't coming on, so maybe you could try another seat. Apologies to Ms Boyack, and I will reflect that in the time.
I appreciate that, Presiding Officer. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it's up to us to decide what we want to debate. And my view is that the choice of this discussion is more about internal SNP strategic discussions than it is about the interests of the country. Because we were told in newspapers in advance of this debate that we'd be offered a detailed blueprint for independence. And yet, what did the Cabinet Secretary do today? He gave us repeated interpretations of history from his perspective. He didn't talk about the future, and once again he offered us a false choice: the status quo or another divisive independence referendum. Now, we are not against constitutional change as Scottish Labour. Over our history, we've advocated and delivered constitutional change. We delivered this Parliament, and not only that, but it's been strengthened since its establishment, and we have done that on a cross-party basis. We have been prepared to speak to people. Sorry, no, I've already tried to take one intervention. The constitutional change we want to see, because I want to focus on what we would like to see that's different, because we don't support the status quo as is. We want to empower people and communities, and where cooperation is key with nations and regions working together, that should be part of the UK's redistributive union. That does not need a divisive referendum. I'll take a brief intervention.
I thank Sarah Boyack for taking an intervention. If she says that she is respecting of democracy, but the policy that was put forward by her leader in August 2022 said that the role of the Scottish Parliament is to be the expression of the democratic will of the people of Scotland. And yet, Labour's amendment today seeks to remove the section in the government motion that says that the UK should be a voluntary union of nations, something that her colleagues in Welsh Labour understand. Why is it that that has been removed if Labour support democracy? I thank Sarah Boyack for taking an intervention. If she says that she is respecting of democracy, but the policy that was put forward by her leader in August 2022 said that the role of the Scottish Parliament is to be the expression of the democratic will of the people of Scotland. And yet, Labour's amendment today seeks to remove the section in the government motion that says that the UK should be a voluntary union of nations, something that her colleagues in Welsh Labour understand. Why is it that that has been removed if Labour support democracy?
I think you'll note... Cue applause. I think you'll note that we have retained the first half of this motion today because we do agree with the proposals, that we acknowledge there was a decision by the Lord Advocate, and we also acknowledge that we want to reaffirm our belief that people in Scotland have the sovereign right to determine the form of government that's best suited to their needs. And we took a decision on that in 2014. That is uncomfortable. That is uncomfortable. And since then, as I said in the opening comments I made, we have seen a change to the devolution settlement. My disappointment with Donald Cameron today not acknowledging that the status quo is perfect. We need to change the status quo. We need change in Scotland. And the best way to do that is not to have an independence referendum. And I would say, you were making a comment about what the voters think. If you look at opinion poll after opinion poll, even SNP, since the election, even SNP voters do not want an independence referendum this autumn. And that is absolutely critical, because there's interpretations of exactly what the voters think. Yes, we are here to represent our constituents, and I am determined to do that, because we are working as Scottish Labour to look at how we change the UK, to make it a more radical UK, a more redistributive UK, and to build on devolution. With respect, Presiding Officer, I didn't heckle other people when they were speaking when I disagree with them.
Members, could we please listen to the Speaker who's got the floor? Sarah Boyack.
Gordon Brown's constitution, which Keir Starmer established, formed the basis of the choice that voters will have at the next election. And it is not a choice between the status quo or the SNP and Greens independence offer. At the next general election, we will have a choice in Scotland to boot out the Tories, to get rid of the undemocratic House of Lords, have a directly elected second chamber, to put in place the cooperation that in the last statement the Cabinet Secretary was talking about the need to do on energy and to tackle the cost of living crisis. And we would reform the intergovernmental working with joint government councils, with secretariats that are not appointed by both governments. There are changes. Now, these don't sound exciting to the SNP, but it is crucial. And I want to finish on this point because the SNP has been a centralising government, taking power away from our local authorities and communities, and we are now seeing services cut in our local communities. It's time to reverse that trend, so it's not just about having more powers to the Scottish Parliament, it's to stop the hoarding of power by this Scottish Parliament, to devolve power to our councils, whether it's on education, on how they invest in critical services like healthcare, in terms of supporting our health system by having care
Ms.
and
Boyack,
support.
I have given you an
invested in.
extra minute. Could you please wind up and move your amendment? Thank you.
There is a better future than the divisive binary choice that's been already highlighted by the SNP today. We want radical change. We want to give people powers to tackle the cost of living crisis.
Ms. Boyack, please
and we
conclude
want
and move
change
your amendment.
now. And that is the choice that we would offer at the next election.
Ms. Boyack, could you please move your amendment?
I move the amendment in my name. Apologies, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise for the Scottish Liberal Democrats. And what a sorry and divisive start this is to the new year. Sometimes I wonder what it is we are even doing here. On the day that our schools are closed and our teachers on strike, when the first period of such industrial action in nearly half a century, when 40 patients, I can hear the SNP laughing at this, but 40 patients are dying. They are dying unnecessarily each week as a part of the crisis in emergency care. And when people face the worst cost of living in living memory, then here we are again. The eyes of the nation are fixed on this chamber, but far from the priorities they sent us here to deal with, they see another skirmish in a make-believe battle that the SNP and Green parliamentarians are fighting entirely on their own. It is make-believe, Deputy Presiding Officer, because there isn't going to be a referendum in October, and the general election won't take its place either. Indeed, it is an act of breathtaking arrogance for the First Minister to simply state that she can dictate the terms of that election. Presiding Officer, we go to the country to receive the instructions from the people who sent us to chambers like this one. It is not for a single politician to tell them that their concerns about the cost of living emergency, about the climate emergency, or the new Cold War in which we find ourselves mean absolutely nothing. And Nicola Sturgeon will find that out the hard way. And for the Green Party to join the SNP in such an enterprise is astonishing. They must be the only Green Party in the entire world to so willingly exchange environmentalism for nationalism. It is a far cry from the party first represented in this place by the respected Robin Harper, who said before the turn of the year of Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater's support for the idea of a de facto referendum. He said, I quote, "I can't believe this has happened. Air quality knows no boundaries." Presiding Officer, in this debate we'll hear a lot about mandates, and more than that, we'll hear about the 2021 Scottish General Election. Deputy Presiding Officer, I remember that election. I remember when the First Minister told people who liked her leadership but didn't want another referendum that they could still vote for her with confidence. I remember when she pivoted back to being the continuity candidate to see us through the pandemic when the polls shifted against independence. And I remember the 25,500 West Edinburgh residents who sent me to this place to oppose another referendum. Theirs, Presiding Officer, theirs is the only mandate that I recognise. All this debate does is allow SNP and Green ministers to distract attention from their singular failure to get to grips with the issues that really matter to people in their day-to-day lives. Knock anybody's door on any given day and ask them what they care about, and they'll tell you. It's whether their sister can access life-saving cancer care, whether their elderly parents are getting the social care that they need. They care about whether their children are receiving an education, or whether they can afford to turn on their heating.
Mr Cole-Hamilton, can you resume your seat? I appreciate that emotions run high in this debate. They will continue to run high, but I would expect the Chamber to listen to whoever is speaking, and I would certainly expect that of the Cabinet Secretary, who's been giving a running commentary on this speech throughout. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
The fact is, Presiding Officer, this government is completely out of touch with reality. They should be using every waking hour in this chamber to clear down NHS waiting times and reduce the crippling cost of living emergency. The government could have chosen, I don't have time, the government could have chosen anything this afternoon, anything at all, but they chose this at a time when this country is looking to us for unified determination on the many problems they face. The government are desperate to reheat this dying argument, and it is a dying argument. You can see that in the language that they use and the way they conduct themselves in this chamber. The Cabinet Secretary refers to us as those who don't agree with the second referendum as democracy deniers. Presiding Officer, these are pages straight out of the Donald Trump playbook. They are ones used by populists, identity nationalists the world over. It is my hope and my expectation that their movement will suffer the same fate as his. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary spoke extensively about winners. Well, I was elected to oppose a referendum with more votes than any other candidate in the history of the Scottish Parliament. The people of West Edinburgh had the right to choose, and they chose me. They put their trust in me to do my job. I will not let them down. It is time that the Scottish Government did theirs.
Thank you, Mr Cole-Hamilton.